Bio. This is Mr. B. We are starting chapter 16 with this video today, and we're still on the theme of evolution, and we're going to look at how evolution occurs inside of an individual population. So our last chapter just talked about what evolution was, kind of gave us all the basic introduction information about evolution. So now we're going to look at how it actually occurs inside of populations. So the first section is called genes and variation. So it's going to look at how, from a genetic standpoint, remember we did the genetics review, how genes actually occur, or how genes play a part in the process of evolution. And so for our first line here, we're going to talk about how common is genetic variation. So many genes have at least two forms or alleles, which again we reviewed the other day, and all organisms have genetic variation that is invisible because it just involves small differences in some of the biochemical processes. So that just means a biochemical process could just be two small differences inside of the same gene between two different organisms, and that can lead to, again, it's genetic variation. They're not identical genetically. And then individual organisms are often heterozygous for many genes, meaning that they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Again, these are all words that we went over. Again, should be review from our genetics chapter. So this is just kind of a common source of genetic variation. And then genetic variation is important because we study it inside of individual populations. And so again, another review word is a population is a group of individuals of the same species that interbreed. So again, that'd just be like all the rabbits in Havana are a population. And so there's genetic variation amongst all the rabbits. They're not all identical. And the way we can represent this genetic variation is through looking at what's called the gene pool. So this is a really important word you're going to need to know, probably show up on the quiz at some point, is that a gene pool consists of all genes, including all the different alleles that are present in a population. So we can actually map out and we can look at all the different genes that are present inside of our population at any given time, and that is called a gene pool. And within our gene pool, in order to kind of break it down, we have what's called the relative frequency. So this again is another really important word that you're going to need to know, is that the relative frequency of an allele is the number of times that the allele occurs inside of a gene pool compared with the number of times other alleles for that same gene occur. So it's basically how many times big A appears compared to little a, if we're talking about just a very simple allele combination right there. So it's how many times the one allele for tall and the allele for short appear inside of a population, and it can be often expressed as a percentage. So if we look at this next picture right here, it breaks it down pretty easily for us. So we have 48% of our population are heterozygous, 16% are homozygous for black, and 36% are homozygous for brown. So this is the allele frequency, so the percent that each allele occurs. And if you look over here, we have our different alleles for black and brown fur. So even though it looks like we have more black mice, it looks like the allele for brown fur shows up more because it is still present in all of those that are heterozygous for black. So that is what our allele frequency, or our relative frequency is. It's just how many times each allele actually appears inside of a population. And so now we've kind of looked at evolution. Again, we got a definition that it's just the change of an organism over time. And now we're going to look at how it actually occurs in terms of genetics. So when we talk about genetics, evolution is any change in the relative frequency of alleles in a population. So we have this population of mice here. In terms of evolution, we would just define that as if these number of allele frequencies change. So if all of a sudden we had 49% of them are homozygous brown, and then of course the other ones would decrease, then we're obviously going to have an evolution in that population and a shift towards being more brown in color as being an advantage. And so now we're going to look at how actually this variation occurs. So what could cause those allele frequencies to change? What could make them shift in such a way? So there's two main sources of genetic variation, and these are mutations. So this is one way that our genes can change inside of a population over time. Mutations, and then the genetic shuffling that results from sexual reproduction. So genetic shuffling and mutations are two very important words. So mutations, genetic shuffling. You're going to need to know the difference between those two and know that the fact that those are two main sources of genetic variation in a population. And so a mutation is our first one, and a mutation is any change in a sequence of DNA. So we talked about all the A's and T's and C's and G's that go along with DNA, and so a mutation is just any time any of that gets changed, and they can occur because of mistakes in DNA replication, so DNA making a copy of itself, or it can be a result of radiation or chemicals in the environment. So actually, remember we talked about in one of our previous chapters, UV radiation was very harmful, and that is actually a source of mutations, is radiation. And mutations, however, they're not always bad. They can happen all the time. They actually do happen all the time, and we don't ever notice them. And it says they don't always affect our organism's phenotype. Remember, a phenotype is the physical characteristics. Again, this is another review word from our crossword puzzle, is that mutations do not always affect our phenotype. So mutations can happen all the time, and our body can just kind of deal with it, and it doesn't really make too much of a difference. But there are times where the mutations do cause genetic variations. And so our next type of variation is gene shuffling. So most heritable differences, so most differences that can be passed on, are due to gene shuffling, and that's just because of the fact that you get half your genes from your mom, half your genes from your dad, so you kind of become a combination of both. And so then crossing over, which again is a process of switching the genes between your mom and your dad to form you, increases the number of genotypes that can appear in an offspring. So genotypes, remember again, another review word there, is our genetic makeup. And then sexual reproduction also produces different phenotypes, but it does not change the relative frequency of alleles in a population. So sexual reproduction, again, that's the reason why we all look different, to why we're not all tall, we're not all short, we all have different colored hair, we have different freckles, different hair types, whether it's curly, wavy, have a widow's peak. So all those things make differences. However, they do not change the relative frequency of alleles. So the same number of alleles are present, it's just they can be represented in different ways. And so now, to wrap up today, we're going to look at what determines the numbers of phenotypes for a given trait. So the number of phenotypes, so again, the number of different physical appearances they can be, are produced for a given trait depend on how many genes control the trait. And so a single gene trait is only controlled by one gene that has two alleles. So variation in this gene leads to only two possible phenotypes. So the example that they give is that you can either have a widow's peak or no widow's peak. That is a trait that can be defined as a single gene trait because there's only two options. You can either have one or the other. So that's a single gene trait only controlled by one gene that has two alleles. And so the allele for widow's peak is dominant over the allele for a hairline with no peak. However, the presence of a widow's peak may be less common in a population. So just because it's the recessive allele does not mean that it can be less common. In real populations, phenotypic ratios, so the ratio of phenotypes, are determined by the frequency of alleles as well as by whether the alleles are dominant or recessive. And then to finish up here, our last one is that many traits are controlled by two or more genes, and these are called polygenic traits. So the word poly means many, genic gene, so a many gene trait. Again, this is another review word. And one polygenic trait can have many possible genotypes and phenotypes, and height in humans is a polygenic trait. And that makes sense because there isn't only two heights in the world. It's not like we're either 5'2" or 6'3". No, there's a variation of height, so therefore they're going to be controlled by many different genes. And we can represent all these different heights by looking at a bell-shaped curve. And so these are going to be important when we look at kind of our next couple sections here. And a bell-shaped curve is typical of polygenic traits, and it shows a normal distribution. So it shows we have some short people, then we get a lot of medium height people, and then few tall people. So that's what that means right there. So that's it for section 1. Let me know if you have any questions.